That voice didn't arrive alone. It learned its shape at the table, in a mother's sigh, in a teacher's clipped correction. It keeps the inflections of hometown streets and the moral tones of Sunday sermons. Small lessons fold into grammar. Public rules become private commands. Over years, family phrases, schoolroom warnings, radio mantras thread together until they sound like truth. Notice how a single line feels inevitable. Whose words are they, really? It grew where you learned to speak. At a kitchen table, between the clink of spoons and a mother's small correction. In a classroom hush. From radio voices over breakfast. A pastor's cadence folded into bedtime stories. Accents carry judgment like seasoning. Phrases arrive already worn. No blame. Just origin. If you follow a single line back, you'll find other people's needs, other people's fear. Trace one sentence to its first speaker. Whom does it answer to? Sometimes the rule didn't arrive as a sentence. It arrived as a look. A tightened jaw at dusk. A sudden hush after a laugh. A teacher's clipped later that felt like a cold line. A parent's small sigh that carried more meaning than any lecture. You learned to move around those sounds. To anticipate them. They smoothed into a private law, precise, quiet, unquestioned. Not blame. Just record. Close your eyes. Listen. Which small cadence first became the voice you obey? They came from the table. A mother's measured blessing. The clink of spoons. From the playground, taunts that became caution. From the classroom, a clipped correction, a weight in the shoulder. From sermons, slogans, lullabies on repeat. Fragments of other people's urgency folded in. Over time they stitched a private grammar for choice. Not blame. Just provenance. Whose sentence do you still answer when night thins speech?
There is a moment that holds. A thin evening light. A hand that steadies. A single sentence, soft, sharp, definitive. Not now. It lands in a child's ear like weather. More tone than grammar. More direction than explanation. The body remembers first. A tightening in the belly. A small retreat. A promise, I will shrink to keep the peace. Later, that promise speaks in errands and hesitations. In bathroom mirrors. In meetings. In sudden silence. Not because it is true. Because it was learned when the stakes felt immediate. We call these imprints. Simple incisions that grow into rules. We are not guilty for them. We are witnesses. So listen quietly. Where did the rule first sound like safety, and when did it begin to sound like a command?
Behind that first "not now" is a track of rooms. A kitchen where a plate slid back without complaint. A hallway where footsteps stopped when words rose. A teacher's low correction. A neighbor's astonished look. Language enters as inheritance. Tone is learned before meaning. Small rituals do the stitching. We learn which silences keep the peace. Which questions are safe? Which anger will burn the air? We carry sentences like talismans, soft warnings, urgent shames, hopeful promises, folded into the way we breathe. The voice is layered: mother's caution, father's pride, a school's rules, the radio's tidy answers. Over time they settle, like dust, into patterns of attention. They become automatic gestures. Listen for those layers now. Begin at the sound of the house you grew up in. Where does this voice find its first shape?
A first imprint is small. A cadence. A single clipped word that lands like a coin on a hard floor. You were 5. Or younger. The kitchen light hummed. Someone's voice tightened and something in you folded to fit it. Maybe it was a look, the way eyebrows drew together and the room cooled. Maybe it was a phrase repeated until it felt inevitable, slow, soft, insistent. The sound taught a shape for feeling. Your body learned the pose. Your breath shortened. You learned when to stop asking. You learned which feelings could live. These moments are not speeches. They are fittings. A tone becomes a law because you respond to it. Because it was safe then. Because it kept you near.
Sit with that. Let one memory surface. Notice the texture of the rule it left. Name it quietly, or simply notice its footprint and wait. That small law did not remain private. It stepped into rooms with you. Into classrooms, kitchens, playgrounds. Into the way a teacher's brow weighed a sentence. Into the hush after a joke.
Others answered the rule. Sometimes with laughter. Sometimes with a quick look away. Each response was a kind of payment. A nod. A sigh. Attention landing like warm light. Those payments taught the rule it had value. So the voice grew. Not by force. By being noticed. Imagine a corridor of small approvals and small cuts. Imagine echoes multiplying against glass and phone screens. What did that voice learn when the world held up a mirror? Listen. Notice which reflections you still follow.
Some moments do the work of a law. A teacher's half smile. A parent's clipped breath. A sentence dropped like a pebble. The room changes its pitch. A child hears and the sound folds into muscle memory. A body learns the shape of obedience before the mind has words for it. These imprints are sensations first. A tightening at the ribs. A face that goes still. A small, steady avoidance. Later, the voice asks for allegiance out of habit. Not conviction. Habit. You can trace it back through those tiny rooms. Not to condemn. To notice what the world once approved of in you. See where it landed. Listen to how it still asks for attention.
Lift your gaze from that small room. The world becomes a hall of mirrors. Teachers. Peers. Screens. A laugh. A look. A scroll. Each response keeps score. Attention feeds certain lines. Silence starves others. A sentence that drew light grew warmer. One that invited quiet cooled and shrank. Slowly, the inner narrator learns what wins a room. It favors the phrases that earn space. It forgets the ones that were folded away. Not judgment, just adaptation. The scripts that persist are the ones the world noticed. So trace the applause. Trace the hush. Who made room for you? Who made you small? Listen a little longer now. Whose approval does your chest still tilt toward?
Inside you, those borrowed lines take on shape. They arrange themselves like players in a small theater. One wears a practiced smile. That is the persona, the face that keeps the room steady. Another speaks in a strict, familiar pitch. The critic. Not just cruelty. A guardian with brittle armor. And then there is the shadow, soft, stubborn, often hushed. It holds the wants you were taught to hide.
None of them is purely you. None is merely wrong. They are adaptations. Strategies. Old languages learn to keep you safe, seen, or invisible. Listen to their accents. The critic is sharp where fear lives. The mask is polite where belonging matters. The shadow murmurs where shame lives. You do not have to argue with every line. You can notice who steps forward. Which of them holds the microphone now? Often the loudest line is not cruelty. It is a fill-in. A rushed answer to an empty place. Where meaning thins, the narrator leans in. It offers certainty. Rules. Warnings. Stories that feel necessary.
This is not clever malice. It is anxiety in work clothes. A map maker tracing borders where none yet exist. Viktor Frankl called it hunger for meaning, an ache that gives voice to any answer. So the critic sharpens. The mask rehearses. The shadow quiets, or rattles. Listen differently for a moment. Not to judge, but to translate. What is the ache trying to point at? What question beneath the command is really asking to be heard?
Meaning often hands itself a story. A clean roll. A label that fits like a coat. Victim. Achiever. Fixer. These are shorthand answers. Easy to repeat. Easier to live inside. Repetition is the engine. Attention is the fuel. Every time we rehearse a line, the neural path deepens. Other possibilities dim. The script sounds more like truth. Notice how the story edits memory. It highlights scenes that belong. It omits the rest. It simplifies messy motives into tidy motives. That tidy script keeps the narrator busy. It provides structure. And at the same time, it narrows the view. There are seams. Small contradictions. Moments when the line stumbles. Listen for those stumbles. They are the place to pause. To learn the next line might not be inevitable.
Stories don't arrive all at once. They assemble. Little episodes become clauses in a private law. A single line, not enough, be careful, becomes a hinge. Say it enough and the hinge opens into a door. You pass through without looking. These scenes prefer the familiar. They reward predictability. Our gaze drifts toward certainty. So the same explanations recur, like worn steps on a staircase. You climb them by habit. Listen for the cues. A tone. A room. A gesture that always summons the answer.
When you watch the loop, it loosens. Not by force. By quiet noticing. What would change if you waited just once? There is a first impression. Not a theory. A small, exact moment. A mother's breath, half alarmed, be careful. A teacher's clipped tone at the back of a classroom. A look that tightened the room. A laugh that folded your confidence away. You heard it with an ear that was still learning what mattered. Your body answered before you could explain. A posture. A swallowed word. The phrase pressed like a coin into soft clay and kept its shape. These imprints are not verdicts. They are habits of attention. They tell you where danger might hide, or where praise will arrive. They are practical, not moral. Listen for the detail. The syllable, the pause, the way a hand moved. If you return there gently, what would you find waiting? Outside the family, the world keeps its own ledger. A teacher's raised eyebrow. A friend's laugh at recess. A screen that rewards blunt certainty. Each glance is a small verdict. Each silence, an instruction. Attention is the economy. It buys posture. It funds a tone. When someone looks, something in you learns to perform. When they don't, another part learns to shrink.
These responses gather. They form a chorus. Not out of malice, but out of efficiency. Feedback loops tighten the language you use with yourself. Praise rehearses certain sentences. Critique quiets others. After a while, the chorus feels like your voice. Listen to who applauds. Notice what the room ignores. If attention is the amplifier, what happens when you change the audience, or simply step out of the room?
From that chorus, characters take shape. A mask for the room. A voice that nags. A shadow shut behind the door. The persona is the face you learn to wear. Polite at dinner. Confident in meetings. It flatters the attention that fed it. It keeps you visible. And safe, in small ways.
The critic is a recorder with old edits. It repeats warnings learned at 5, at 15, quieter now, but no less certain. It trims risk. It demands neatness. Sometimes it sounds like care. Often it sounds like fear. The shadow holds what was pushed away. Anger. Need. Embarrassment. It doesn't vanish, it accumulates texture. It slips into dreams. It shows up as stubborn habits, or sudden silence.
They are not enemies. They are improvisations. Skilled, adaptive. They ask for something: protection, approval, relief. Listen. Name them if you must. Ask, quietly, what they want next. And then wait. When meaning thins, the room gets noisy. The critic raises its voice. The shadow rattles the windows. The persona keeps talking to fill the echo.
Viktor Frankl named the hunger behind that noise. Suffering often behaves like a compass. Not a verdict. A pointer. When life lacks anchor, the inner chorus scrambles for one. It invents urgency. It offers maps drawn from old fear. Listen for function, not drama. What is the voice trying to protect? What horizon is it steering you toward? Sometimes it points at safety. Sometimes at ash. Sometimes at something honest, half buried.
Treat the loudness as signal. Ask a quiet question. Wait. The answer may be slow, or strange, or soft. And if you can, keep listening. There is more to learn.
Stories have weight. They pile up, one sentence pressing into the next, until a shape holds: victim, achiever, fixer. Simple lines become scaffolding. They turn into the voice that answers first, before you think.
Think of a record played on repeat. The groove deepens. The needle drops in automatically. So does the breath. So do the choices. Habit gives the story an air of inevitability. The trick is that these stories are often recipes, not truths. They were learned for reasons long ago. They were useful then. They are weary now. Listen for the seams. Notice a phrase you use without wanting. Notice how the body tightens when the old line begins. Ask, softly, where this story learned its form.
You don't need an overhaul. Try one small edit. One quieter sentence. See what shifts. See what resists. See what stays. What might you whisper instead?
they harden by being said again. A line repeats. Then another. Together they carve a path. The path becomes identity. Victim. Achiever. Fixer. Labels that move first, before you do. Notice the mechanics. A trigger. A familiar phrasing. A tightened breath. The rest follows: choices, posture, explanation. The script fills the gap so you don't have to decide. These patterns are not prophecy. They are rehearsals. Rehearsals that felt safe once. Rehearsals that now limit scenes you could enter. You can meet them like weather. Name the role when it arrives. Pause. Feel how the body believes the line. Then ask, quietly, if you want to stay in that part. Not every scene needs rewriting. Some just need a different entrance. Listen for the narrator's favorite sentence. What would happen if you answered with something softer? Stories don't arrive whole. They arrive as fragments, snatches of comment, a look, a single reprimand, and then they gather weight. Labels act like lenses. They simplify. They sort your moments into neat piles: injured, competent, responsible. Repetition welds the pieces together. Each retelling narrows the view. Memory favors what confirms the line. Other possibilities blur. The trap isn't that the story is untrue. It's that it becomes the only microphone in the room. You stop searching for other voices. You answer the same prompt, again and again. Loosening it starts small. Find the scene where the story first stuck. Name it. Pause long enough to feel the mismatch. Try a different answer. A softer posture. A silence that isn't avoidance but listening. What sentence might sound different if you let it breathe? Beyond the scene, the room opens onto other rooms. Mirrors appear: a teacher's tone, a friend's laugh, the blue light of a screen. Tiny responses become instructions. A nod inflates a phrase. A rebuke tightens the chest. Attention is fuel. It chooses what repeats. Over time, those choices recruit the private voice. It learns which lines win a smile. It softens where silence punishes. The social gaze does more than describe. It sculpts. Even anonymous applause trains the ear. Habits settle into rhythm. You move in the key that kept you safe.
Breathe. Which audiences do you carry inside? Whose eyes have you learned to answer? Beyond the mirrors, inside the quiet, voices become people. One wears a mask. She learned to smile for approval. She speaks in practical sentences. She keeps the room calm. Another sits with folded arms. The critic. He knows where you failed. He repeats a phrase that tightens the chest. His voice narrows choices. In the corner, the shadow waits. It holds the parts you quietly relegated: anger, longing, a stubborn, foolish grace. not enemy, just unattended.
You do not have to dissolve them. You can watch their gestures. Name one. Ask it a simple question. Listen for the answer. See what shifts.
If you sit with that named voice, something shifts. The loudest chatter often comes from an empty room. Viktor Frankl called it the ache for meaning. When meaning thins, the mind fills the space with instructions, warnings, stories. They sound urgent. They feel like guidance. But they are often attempts to point toward a lack, connection, purpose, safety. The critic rants because meaning is missing. The mask smiles because belonging was once a contract. None of this makes you broken. It makes you human. So ask the voice a soft question. What are you trying to keep me from losing? Listen for the answer. It may be clumsy. It may be wise. Or it may only point to a silence worth exploring.
Stories arrive like garments. We put them on because they fit the moment. Victim, achiever, fixer. Labels that simplify. They shorten the day. They make action predictable. Repetition is their tailor. Each telling tightens a seam. Attention stitches the hem.
They are not truths. They are habits, patterns shaped by praise, fear, and habit. When the world is complicated, a clear story is a relief. It narrows choices. It narrows compassion. But a narrow story can become a cage. It edits perception until only confirming evidence remains. You start to arrange life around the role, rather than living through it. So listen for the clause that always returns. Notice the rhythm. Name the part that repeats. Let it sit, unanswered for a moment. See what wants to breathe in that silence.
Name it. Say the word that keeps returning. Not to condemn. Not to fix. To separate the echo from you. Offer it a seat across the room. Watch how posture softens when authority is moved a little distance. Ask a plain question. Why are you here? Then listen. Breathe. Wait. Notice tone more than content. Is it tired? Anxious? Proud? Hungry for certainty? Let the answers arrive like small weather fragments, half phrases, a stubborn reheated warning. Don't answer every sentence. Hold a curious silence instead. Let the voice finish, or fizzle. See what it does when it is heard without being obeyed. And then, what does it ask for next? Now turn inward through the body. Feet on the floor. Spine easy. Shoulders release a little. Place a hand where breath moves. Notice the rise. Notice the fall. Take 2 slow breaths. Not to fix anything. To make room. Feel the space that opens, small, ordinary, useful. That space is a margin. A delay between impulse and action.
Try a tiny experiment. Wait 10 seconds before replying to the next message. Let the pause be a witness. Watch the inner voice shift when it is not obeyed at once. Sometimes it quiets. Sometimes it amplifies. Sometimes it shows a new face. These are low-stakes rehearsals. They teach the nervous system a different rhythm. And slowly, the voice begins to meet you across this new distance. What happens if you keep that distance for a minute more? Now begin small. Not a revolution. A modest edit. Notice the line that comes first, the one that tells you to hurry, to apologize, to prove. Hear its shape. Then gently offer an alternative. A softer phrase. A question instead of a verdict. A quiet acknowledgement instead of an immediate defense.
Try it in low stakes. When someone asks a simple favor, answer with, "I'll check," rather than, "Yes." When the inner voice says, "You failed," respond with, "Interesting, where did that come from?" Watch what changes. Often nothing dramatic. Often something shifts.
These are experiments, not promises. They teach a different grammar. Small edits. Minor keys. Over time the song alters. What single line could you try changing tomorrow? If the first edit is an experiment, the next step is curiosity about origin. Listen for the rooms where those lines first arrived. A kitchen at dusk. Someone folding hands around a question and answering with a sigh. A classroom where a correction landed like a small stamp. A public reprimand that taught you how shame sounded. The lullaby that threaded caution into melody. Not just the words. The cadence. The look. The way a voice tightened at the edges. These moments collect. They stitch together into a single, unbidden narrator. It is not mysterious. It is inherited, piece by piece. So the work that follows a small edit is quiet archaeology. You follow a sentence back to the room that taught it. Which room holds yours? Lean into that room. Hear the phrase again. Not the idea so much as the sound. A tired later that fell like a lid. A teacher's sharp correction that clipped your breath. Someone's sigh that made your hands still.
Notice the sensation first. The hollow behind the sternum. The small recoil. The way your voice shrinks. For a child, a tone is a map. A look plus a consequence becomes a rule. Step back, speak less, earn your place.
It made sense then. It felt safe. So the pattern stayed. Over time, a single cadence took on authority. It began to narrate the small moments, meals, elevators, first dates. Quiet commands that no longer needed a speaker. So you listen. Where did that first sentence settle in you? How does it sound now? Follow that voice back. Hear where it learned to speak. At the kitchen table, a command folded into conversation. Finish your plate, said between bites. In class, a correction loud enough to make shame settle. On the playground, a chant, a shove, a laugh that taught you to shrink. Over the radio, on billboards, in passing remarks, tones that felt like weather.
Language brings posture. Tones bring consequence. Over years, these fragments weave an internal dialect. Not stolen. Passed down. Pick one line. Trace it to a room, a gesture, a face. Whose rhythm does it still echo? Something small fixes. A tone. A look. A sentence, "Don't make a fuss," said once, becomes instruction. You felt it as a change in the body. The chest tightened. Breath shortened. Later, the world rewarded the obedience. Quiet was met with calm. Noise brought flinches. Over time, that contingency folded into an axiom. Not dramatic. Almost invisible. A child's ear learning rules of safety. We carry them like manners. They feel sensible. They feel true. Sit with one. Notice where your body still obeys. Whose quiet are you keeping?
Outside that small rule, the world answered. A relieved smile from a parent. A teacher's soft correction. A laugh in the playground. A notification that lands like approval. Attention turned into heat. Heat became habit. Each nod, each silence, stitched the voice tighter into your chest. The mirror you faced was not neutral. It rewarded some tones and muted others. You learned which parts would be seen, which parts would be praised, which parts would be shoved away. So the voice that feels private is often a ledger of responses. Listen for a moment. Whose applause lives in your ribs? It learned to speak in rooms. A kitchen at dusk. A father smoothing a tie with one hand and a thin reprimand with the other. A mother's lullaby that folded worry into melody. A teacher's clipped sentence. A cousin's mocking laugh. Public prayers that taught shame as rhythm. Each phrase pressed like a thumbprint. Language carried favors and fines. Over time, these fragments arranged themselves into grammar rules you follow before you think. Try to name where your voice was taught. A room, a meal, a line of song. What echoes are still moving in you? Some of those echoes began as a single, small thing. A clipped "not now," a slump of the shoulders. A look across the table that folded conversation away. A reprimand repeated until it sounded like weather. A child's ear keeps the shape more than the meaning. It learns the rhythm, the urgency, the place to stop. Years later, the same cadence rises before any choice. Notice it. Not to blame yourself, but to see how the rule was pressed in. Which first sentence still closes the door when you try to speak?
But the voice did not stay private. It stepped into rooms where others watched. A teacher's sigh. A friend's laugh. A screen's soft approval. Attention settles like sediment. A look can make a doubt feel true. Praise repeats a posture. Correction carves a rule deeper. We learn to move for the mirror, to preempt its tilt, to match its breath. Over years, private thought becomes public habit. The chorus of small responses writes the script. And when the room quiets, when the mirrors turn away, what holds the line then?
When the mirrors leave, something else remains. A mask slides into place. It fits the room. It smiles when it must. It tightens when danger smells familiar. Beside it sits a quieter shape, the shadow. Not sinister, simply unspoken. It holds what the mask forgets to show. Between them lives the critic. Sharp, familiar, and oddly dutiful. Sometimes it warns. Sometimes it repeats an old correction, word for word. It sounds like a teacher, or a parent, or a paused public laugh. These parts are not enemies. They are actors learning lines. Listen to how they speak. Ask where a line came from, and who taught it to pause.
Sometimes the critic speaks loudest in rooms that feel empty. When meaning thins, sound fills the pause. The voice reaches for maps it no longer has. It offers rules, urgencies, quick answers. Often these are not commands but attempts to orient. Pain becomes a compass needle trembling. That trembling can feel like failure. Or like a signal. Sit with it for a moment. No fixing. Just attention. Notice what it seeks. Meaning. Safety. Approval. The questions matter more than immediate solutions. And if the voice is a messenger, what might it be trying to point toward?
If the voice is trying to point, what does it point at? Safety. Belonging. A reason to keep breathing. Often it offers the wrong route. It confuses certainty for meaning. It repeats instructions that once kept you small but alive. Listen to its accent. Listen to the textures: shame, tenderness, habit. Ask the quiet question without haste: where did this direction come from? Not to judge. To map. To follow the line backward, room by room, sentence by sentence. There are origins. Small domestic scenes. Public lessons. 1,000 tiny echoes. We will trace them. Slowly.
Walk the rooms that taught your ear. Steam above a kitchen table. A father's offhand rule, soft as a cutlery clink. A teacher's clipped praise. Peer laughter, quick and wounding. Public announcements learned as authority. Small rituals, shoes by the door, hands folded, become punctuation. These moments deposit language. They press suggestion into sensation. Over years they form a map you follow by habit. Not blame. Just origin. See the sentences that live inside you. Which one arrived first? Which tone still opens doors you thought were yours? There is a first moment. Not a theory, a small, fizzy thing, a look, a cough, a sharp syllable. You were 5. Or 7. Time blurs. A hand turns your sentence back into silence. A voice names you. The naming becomes law.
Notice the feel. The throat tightens. The belly learns to answer. A rule nests in a gesture. It sits there, patient as a stone. We do not hunt culprits. We slow down. We feel the shape of the rule. Where did it press? What did it save you from, and what did it cost? Listen. What would that first voice say if you simply asked it, why? When you ask, the room answers. Not one voice. Many. A grandmother's scold beside the clatter of dishes. A teacher's clipped correction at a blackboard. The radio's cadence. The way your language tucks shame into a sentence. Small rituals, meals, prayers, public rules press into the ear.
They stitch together. Over years the stitches become a seam. The scene feels like you. It keeps you visible. It narrows the doors you notice. So you listen. Which of these echoes are still yours? Which would you invite to stay?
Some rules begin as accidents. One evening. A sharp "be careful." A look that made your shoulders fold. A laugh that froze the room.
In a child's body, these moments find a place. A tone becomes a shape. A sentence becomes a hinge. Over years, the hinge hardens into habit. You learn to move around it. The memory is quiet. It sits as a small pressure behind the collarbone, at the base of the throat, in the sudden stillness of a hand. There is no blame here. Just a map.
Where did that map etch itself? What would it sound like if you named it? Often the voice is not born in a single sentence. It is stitched from small domestic moments. A bowl set down with a sigh. A teacher's clipped correction. A joke that landed like a cold wind. A public announcement on the radio at dawn. Those sounds settle. They become grammar. They give taste to fear, shape to caution. Over time, the voice borrows cadence and accent from errands, lullabies, reprimands. Listen quietly. Hear where it learned to pause, where it learned to warn, where it learned to love and to shrink. What would it say if you named it?
There is usually a first time. A phrase. A tone. A look that lands and stays. A parent's warning, casual and final. A teacher's sigh that measures worth. A laugh that points and doubles shame. You were small. Your ear was open. The sound found purchase in the body. The throat tightens, the shoulders tuck, hands learn to disappear. A rule becomes a posture. It carries feeling more than reason. Listen now for that earliest line you obeyed without asking. Name its shape. Let it sit. Notice what it asks of you next.
Outside that first rule, the room multiplied. Mirrors arrived in faces. A teacher's approving nod. A friend's laugh that trimmed you smooth. A screen that leaned in with light. These small responses kept score. Attention became currency. What drew looks grew louder inside. What was ignored folded up and learned to wait.
Reinforcement is quiet work. It layers itself like wallpaper, patterns you stop seeing until you notice the peel. Over time, the sound in your head matches the parts that once earned a glance. Listen now. Which gestures still call you forward? Which silences shape the lines you follow?
That applause and those silences become characters. One is the persona, the mask you learn to wear, polite, efficient, visible. Another is the shadow, what the light had you hide, warm, heavy, patient. Then there's the critic. Not a verdict. A messenger in an old tone. It warns. It remembers what was punished. It sounds like care but cuts. Picture them in a room. The persona on a chair. The shadow at the window. The critic at the door. Give them names. Ask the critic, quietly, why it speaks.
It answers with urgency. A small, older voice that believes structure will save you. In emptier rooms that belief turns loud. Viktor Frankl noticed this. When meaning thins, the mind scrambles for maps. Rules become anchors. Anxious narratives light themselves like harbor beacons, urging you toward safety. They can feel necessary. They can also be mistaken for truth.
Suffering is not a sentence. Often it's a signal pointing to a missing compass. The critic tries to orient with the language it knows: worry, command, reproach. Listen for the direction, not just the volume. What is it trying to protect? What would it ask for with a different map?
Stories are economical. They compress a life into repeatable lines. Say "I'm not enough" once, and 1,000 small moments answer back. Roles settle: the victim, the fixer, the achiever, and the day keeps to their script. Habit rehearses the voice until it feels like fate. Notice the seams. Not to hurry. Just to see. What line wants editing? Editing begins with one soft test. Pause when a line rises. Name it, not to fix, but to look. Hear its cadence. Where did it come from? You don't need a solution. You only need a witness. Then, in a small place, offer a different phrase. A modest counterpoint. Not to overthrow the story. Just to see if the room changes. Wait. Breathe. Listen. Notice what answers back.
Now lean in. Not to argue, but to learn its weather. Ask one patient question. Wait. Let the answer arrive as tone, not proof. Note the urgency and the tenderness. Offer a limit. Offer a kindness. Close that exchange like closing a window, partial, attentive. Sit with the room after. Watch what shifts. Stay where you are. Let the room hold you. Bring attention down to the ribs. A slow exhale. Let shoulders soften. Notice the delay between impulse and motion. This gap is small. It is a practice ground. No fixing. No argument. Just measurements of sensation. Over time, these murmurs lengthen. They become available. See what small choices arise when you stop answering immediately.
Stay. Let the breath become slower, deliberate. Lengthen the spine by a fingertip. Shift weight a degree. When the inner voice tightens, soften toward it. Allow a beat, 3 heartbeats, before you move. Notice what shifts: posture, temperature, tone. Small margins reveal different options. In that quiet, what voice will speak next?
In that quiet, what voice will speak next? Listen to its shape. Note the tone, the tense. Offer a softer sentence, one you could believe. Try it once aloud, or simply think it. Small edits travel farther than we expect. Let the body respond. If resistance rises, bow to it. Wait. See what follows. Let the line sink in. Feel where it rests: throat, chest, the small hollow behind the ribs. If it feels foreign, ask it one quiet question. Don't fix it. Learn it. Breathe. Hold the hesitation without filling it. This is a tiny experiment. Later you'll try it elsewhere. For now, wait. See what the room answers. Names and tones arrive like weather. A mother's hush over a scraped knee. A father's low correction. Teachers with sharp clocks. Public chants at morning assemblies. Small rules folded into ordinary days. They settle in the bones. You carry them before you name them. Sit with one. Notice its accent. Where did it learn to sound so like you? Wait. Listen to where it came from. The clatter of dishes. The word said at bedtime. A reprimand in the kitchen. A teacher's half phrase, handed down in the hallway. Languages of judgment and kindness stitched into grammar. They lived in you long before they were named. Trace one line back. What room held it first?
Follow it out of the room. It slips through door frames. The smell of simmering soup. A mother's shorthand. A teacher's clipped instruction. A neighbor's laugh that teaches shame. Small phrases gather like coins. They jingle into the pocket of your speech. Over years, dialects of duty and care become default. They forget their origin. So listen again, softly. Which hands shape the syntax of your wanting? Someone spoke. A single line. Not loud, but certain. A look folded into the sound. You learned the rhythm before the meaning. The rule landed in the shape of your chest. Later you obeyed its cadence without remembering who had said it. Memory returns in fragments, a kitchen tile, a schoolyard hush, the small tilt of an adult's head. Listen. Where in your body does that first command still sit? What might it answer if we only asked its name?
There is a longer history here. A voice braided from breakfasts and proverbs. From the cadence of a parent's warning, the slogans painted on school walls, the hush that fell at dinner. Language settles like sediment. Commands accumulate into habit. Not everything inside you began with you. Sometimes you still answer in someone else's rhythm. Whose voice would you invite to sit beside you?
Think of the first sentence that landed. A mother's tight breath before not now. A teacher's clipped correction. A friend's laugh at a mistake. The sound was small. It found a corner and stayed. Over years it learned a grammar, when to warn, when to shrink. This is not accusation. It is a map. Close your eyes. Can you find that corner now? What does it say, quietly, when you move? Outside that corner, the room widens. Mirrors gather, classmates' glances, a teacher's nod, the soft echo of a screen. Each look selects a line. Attention thickens a phrase. Silence lets others evaporate. Over time those reflections stitch together a public accent. You begin to recognize your voice in their echoes. Pause. Which mirror learned your lines? And which ones still wait to be asked?
Those mirrors stitch voices into resonance. One learns manners and becomes a mask, the persona, polished for the room. One keeps a ledger, the critic, alert to mistakes. One hides the unclaimed pieces, the shadow, blunt and patient. They trade lines inside you. They are not judges, only characters with histories. Notice which one takes the lead in small moments. Notice how they borrow your voice.
When meaning thins, the voice grows larger than the room. In that quiet, the critic screams for certainty. Anxious narratives hurry in to fill the empty space. Frankl called it a compass gone blunt, suffering as signal, not sentence. The voice wants to orient you, clumsy and earnest. Stay with it. Breathe. Ask, quietly, what is it pointing toward? In empty rooms, stories assemble. Small phrases repeat until they become identity: the cautious child, the reliable fixer, the burned-out achiever. Each role has a logic. It seeks confirmation. Attention fans it, like small embers. We act as if they are true. Which lines play beneath your choices? Some lines start at tables. A reprimand over a spilled cup. A taught syllable of quiet at bedtime. A teacher's brief praise after a test. These small recordings fold inward. They become grammar. Not accusation, just ledger. You learn the syntax of obedience and favor. Over years the archive speaks as certainty. Close enough to feel like self. Far enough to be borrowed. Which first sound named you? Sometimes it's one syllable. A look that cut the room. A rule arrives as sensation, stomach tightening, shoulders narrowing. You don't argue. You learn to move around it. Later, the phrase returns in mornings, indecisions, like an old map. Remember a small hand, a reprimand, the hush after. Who taught your edges? Listen. There may be a single moment when the voice first took shape. Maybe it happened on the kitchen tiles. A bowl toppled. A voice, low, flat, said, "Not so loud." A hand pressed into your shoulder. The room stilled. Your breath shortened. The phrase folded into urgency, then habit. Years later it returns as instruction, as weather. You don't have to judge that hour. Look at it. Name its shape. What did that rule teach you to avoid?
Maybe it isn't just the kitchen. It lives in the clipped manners at the table. In a father's offhand warning. In a teacher's tired phrase. A hymn sung on Sundays. A public sign. Language's layered tones, pauses, what was praised, what was shamed. Over time these fragments stitch into a single tone. You hear it and obey. Whose mouth first taught you that rhythm?
It travels. Worn phrases folded into lullabies. The sharpness of a scold. The praise that sounded like a ledger. Family recipes, arguments at the table, a schoolyard jeer, all compress into one voice. You adopted its rhythms. You answered before you thought. Accents of belonging and warning settle in the throat. Follow them back and you find rooms, faces, a language of small demands. Where do you trace it first? Sometimes it begins with a single sentence. A hand on a shoulder. A "not now" said with the quiet that stops a child in their tracks. The tone carves a rule. You feel the knot behind your ribs. A small moment becomes habit. Where did that line land? Beside the bed, at the table, in the silence between speakers.
A phrase arrives. Not loud. A curvature of tone. It lands in the chest like a coin. You learn its weight. Your days tilt toward it. A rule is no louder than a trembling. Years on, the cadence still opens doors. You obey before you think. What other sentences were folded into you, waiting to be unfolded? Often it begins at a small table. The clink of cutlery. A reprimand folded into a lullaby. A teacher's glance that taught you how to stand. A slogan on a wall. Names given and withheld. Fragments gather. They learn to speak for you. They settle into muscle and breath. Which kitchen first taught that grammar?
Then the room opens outward. Grandmother's hum. A coach's whistle. An advertisement's hungry promise. A sermon, a roll call, a neighbor's barbed praise. Tongues layer. Rhythm and reprimand become habit. The lines find muscle. You learn to pause where others paused. The inner voice gathers these stitches. It is an archive, not an oracle. Which of its fragments still speaks for you?
Sometimes a single phrase settles and shapes the room. A teacher's clipped, "Not like that." A mother's hushed warning. The tilt of a father's disappointment. You feel it first in the throat, a tightening, a small recalibration, and the rule becomes muscle. Quiet now. Try harder. Don't ask. It is not dramatic. It is practical. It keeps you safe in small ways. Decades later, it still knows the route. Which of those first lines still moves through you, unasked? They arrive as small scenes. A mother smoothing your sleeve. Words over the sink. A teacher's repeat. A coach's glare. Language nests in appetite, in posture. Public scolding becomes private law. A lullaby turns into instruction. Family grammar, who speaks, who is silent, stitches a narrator into your bones. These voices carry culture, neighborhoods, praise, the shape of shame. Trace one line back. Follow it to a table, a playground, a sermon. Where did yours first cross the threshold? Sometimes it wasn't a lesson. It was a tone. A tightened jaw at the table. A sentence clipped in passing, and the child inside you learned form. A rule took shape not in argument but in breath. Obey. Shrink. Be useful. These imprints are not blame. They are recordings. Listen to the place they live under the ribs, behind the eyes. Name one. Notice its grammar. What did it ask of you?
Now follow it outward. Not far, just a step. The kitchen light where rules were named. The first teacher who praised the wrong shoulder. A word that echoed in assembly. A parent's sigh that became punctuation. Language carries weight. Culture hands down a grammar of worth. Small repetitions stitch a voice into your grammar. It becomes yours by practice, not by truth. Try to map one corridor, one household phrase, one public line. Where did it first sound?
A single moment holds the pattern. A teacher's aside. A mother's clipped "be careful." The tilt of a brow that meant "not now." A child's ear tightens. What was spoken becomes a rule. It sits like a coin in the pocket, molded by heat, used without thought. Listen. Can you feel that first crease? What did it ask you to become? Those early lines have origins: kitchens and school halls, the lullaby's cadence, the neighbor's sharp laugh. A sentence at the table. A reprimand in the corridor. Words from language and ceremony pile up quietly. They settle as grammar inside the chest. Over time, inheritance and habit become indistinguishable. You carry accents of other people's rules. Not accusation. Observation. Start to name them. Where did they begin? Sometimes it happens in a single afternoon. A look. A tone. A phrase that folds the world inward. You learn the rule before you learn the reason. It settles like a small stone behind the sternum. Later, you consult it as if it were your own counsel. No judgment. Just notice. The laugh that narrowed a door. The hush after a mistake. The phrase repeated until it became grammar. When did it first save you? When did it first stop you? And what would it say now?
If you listen, you can hear where it came from. A mother's careful correction at the kitchen table. A grandfather's proverb muttered over soup. The teacher's clipped warning in a hallway. Language like laundry folded into the chest. Small rituals, repeated. They stitch together. They become an archive you were without noticing. Not theft. Inheritance. And if you trace the thread, what names would you find? Listen to where it gathered, the clink of spoons, a half-sung lullaby, a teacher's clipped "not now." Phrases folded into daily rhythm. An accent that taught hesitation. Public praise that taught measure. Small commands, like stitches, hold shape. It becomes architecture. You move through rooms already labeled. Whose hands hung those signs?
It traces like water through rooms. Mother's clipped instructions over the sink. A grandfather's laugh folded into a lesson. The grammar of the town, shop shutters, school bells, the way people clear their throats. Languages stack. Accents map authority. Over time, those small sounds settle inside. They begin to name you. Later, alone, you hear them. Which lines will you answer? A single sentence can become a law. The tilt of a head. The hush after a mistake. A mother's weary "not now," folded into a lifetime of waiting. A teacher's sharp "try harder," pressed down on a small chest. You learn the rhythm. You learn where to shrink. Memory keeps the tone. Not only what was said, but how it landed. Later, those shapes return as orders. Gentle. Insistent. Sometimes caring. Sometimes unfamiliar.
Those orders have parents. A kitchen where plates chimed like judgment. A teacher's praise that read as a ledger. An aunt's warning folded into lullabies. A sermon's hush that taught which doubts to carry. Public attention refined the tone, applause, then silence. Other people's punctuation settled in your chest. They stitched themselves into grammar. You speak them without looking. They arrive like weather, familiar and slightly off. Pause. Listen. Whose punctuation sits in your mouth?
It begins in a room. Small scenes teach grammar. A mother folding a napkin while saying, "Be careful." A father clearing his throat, silence thick with meaning. A teacher underlining one mistake until it reads like law. A congregation holding breath. The language of meals, chores, prayers, reprimands, slowly grafted. These phrases settle like shorthand. You learn to translate them into action. Not all were meant to be yours. Pause. Which one first showed you how to answer? There is always a first imprint. A clipped syllable. A hand that stopped mid-air. A look that taught you where the line was. As a child, you repeated the sound to find safety. Over time, the syllable hardened into a rule. Quiet became obedience. Later, you traced the rule's owner, sometimes distant, sometimes intimate. Pause. What did that first tone ask you to do?
Outside the child's room, other mouths answered. A teacher's sharp line. A friend's laugh. A screen that kept returning the same face. Each glance, each correction, fed the whisper. Attention is the currency. Things we notice grow louder. Others' approval stitches authority into us. In the quieter replies, compassion, doubt, go unheard. Which reflections did you let tend the voice?
Some echoes arrived soft. Others landed like instruction. A teacher's clipped, not like that. A sister's sigh that taught smallness. Praise that sketched a map. Ridicule that bolted a door. Over years, a few moments hardened into rule. They remain tone more than words. If you let your ear wander back, what was the first line you learned to obey?
Sometimes a sentence arrived like weather. A single tone. A look. The child frozen mid-step. A rule formed as sensation, the tightening at the throat, the way shoulders folded. Later the phrase returns without context, steering choices. Notice it. Hold it without blame. Remember the exact cadence. Let the memory sit. Then ask, gently, who else learned to listen to that voice?
Often it begins in a single room. A mother's hush over a spilled cup. A teacher's clipped name. A look that folded a child inward. The body remembers before the mind. A phrase becomes a scene quiet, exact, decisive. Later you repeat it without thinking. Notice the muscle beneath the breath. Name the first sound that sounded like law. Where did that sentence first land?
trace it through small rooms. A pot clattering. A corrected grammar. A shout in a corridor. Each moment leaves a phoneme, a posture, a rule. Language stitches itself to bone. Old praises and scoldings become shorthand. Public notices, church, school, television, lay new tiles beside the first seam. Over time, the room widens until the voice sounds like home. Whose home is that, exactly? A single phrase. A sharp look. The way a parent sighed after you spoke. In a child's ear, such moments harden. They become maps. Not arguments, but felt certainties. Rules carved into posture. Later they return as instructions, uninterrogated. Watch them. Name the feeling they carry. Notice where your body tightens. See what that voice was asking, and what it left unanswered.
Think of a kitchen at dusk. A plate slid across the table. A reprimand under breath. A teacher's clipped praise. A radio chorus. Small lines repeated. They settled like lint in a pocket. They stitched themselves into your tone. Trace them back slowly. Whose syllables are echoing now? Now widen the frame. A mother's sigh at dawn. A grandfather's joke. The teacher's folded hands. A hymn on the radio. Words taught at the table. Accents, gestures, rules passed like plates. Language carrying favors and warnings. They became a grammar you move by. Not ownership, but inheritance. Trace the seams. Which lines sang you into being? And then a single moment hardened. A phrase, "Be quiet," said with a small, steady voice. A look. The tilt of a mouth. The room holding its breath. For a child, that sound was proof. It became a rule. Not argued for. Accepted. A click in the body. A movement learned. Years later it speaks first. Listen to its shape. What sensation keeps answering before you do?
At some point the rule found its skin. A teacher's sigh, a parent's diverted gaze, a small tightening in the room, each paired with a command until sound and consequence braided together. The child learned by feeling. Tone became shorthand for safety. A phrase turned into a fingerprint on the nervous system. Years later it speaks first, already voiced. Notice where it lives, the tight throat, the hollow behind the sternum, the slight recoil. What first made it stick? Often it begins as a small accident. A phrase said once, a tone that closed the room. The child remembers the cadence more than the words. A rule forms where attention met fear. Years later the rule still wakes first. Listen for the echo. Who spoke it that night? What was it trying to protect?
Remember the nightlight glow. A single sentence. A look that pinched the air. The tone carried a verdict. The child learned to obey shape and silence. The rule wasn't argued, it was felt, a tightening in the chest, a shrinking of movement. It lodged there, small and practical. Not malice. A protection, poorly translated. Sit with that memory. Listen to the feeling it left. What does that old instruction want now?
Other rooms join that hush. A mother's sigh at the kitchen table. A teacher's clipped correction in winter light. A public admonition from the radio, familiar as clockwork. Fragments stitched together, a grammar of caution, a tempo of restraint. Language becomes an heirloom that sits in the ribs. Trace the seams. Who did the sewing?
Those scenes lead outward. A grandmother's lullaby hummed between dishes. A neighbor's shorthand for danger. The language at the table, measured, unsparing, tender in its own way. Small moments, spoon against bowl, a sharp look, a schoolyard laugh, press into you. Over years they settle as grammar. You carry an archive of others' urgencies. Not blame. Just provenance. If you listen closely, can you hear which lines came from you? There is a first imprint. A phrase, flat and decisive. A look that folded a question. Hands that steadied, hands that pushed away. The room smelled like toast or bleach. The tone was small but precise. It became a rule, quietly. Listen, what did that single sound teach you to expect? The room widened. A laugh, a look, a repeated correction. Other people's eyes scored the rule. Attention folded it into habit. Small acknowledgments became proof. Outside voices polished the edge. Over time, the private sound learned to speak for a crowd.
It carries accents. A scold at the table. The tone of a late-night warning. A teacher's clipped instruction. Meals become lessons. Laughter marks the right shape. Small rituals bind meaning into posture and breath. We inherit tones before conclusions. Trace the voice back. Where it first learned to ask for permission.
Sometimes one phrase did the work. I'll look. A syllable caught like a hook behind the ribs. It became grammar. You learned to obey before you knew the reason. Sit still. Don't laugh. Be quiet. Later, that soft rule still opens the door. What room does it keep closed? Sometimes the voice arrived folded into other mouths. A parent's hush over dinner. A teacher's clipped sentence. A neighbor's sigh that stilled you. Small repetitions became scaffolding. You carried the cadence of someone else's care. Which parts are yours? Which were handed down like heirlooms, and which can be set down? Sometimes a single phrase held the shape of a rule. Be quiet. Finish what you start. It landed like a stone. We learned to move around it. Not by force, but by habit. Notice one sentence. Sit with it. Ask, who first spoke this into you? Maybe it was your mother, an uncle, a corridor whisper at school. A tone more than exact words. A cup's clink. I'll look. We folded it into our posture. It sounds inevitable now. In a quiet room you can hear its edges. Name it. Sit with that sound. Ask gently where it stops. There is more to ask. A hand's small push. A clipped laugh. The pause that taught you to quiet. It folded into habit. Later it speaks as fact. Sit with that moment. Feel where it lives, jaw, breath, spine. Don't fix it. Notice. What question would it answer if you asked softly?
Listen further. That clipped laugh has a pedigree, a kitchen voice, a teacher's reprimand, a broadcast hum. Names, meals, rules, small acts that settled inside. They braided together until a private claim sounded like your own. Where did they first come to rest? Follow the loose thread. A phrase. A look. A tone that clipped the room and stayed behind your ribs. You heard it once and it learned you. Little rules took root: be quiet, be useful, don't take up space. Memory holds the shape more than the sentence. Listen without blame. Which small sound first found a home inside you?
It lived first in other mouths. In the clatter of Sunday dishes. In a teacher's tight smile. In jokes that taught you to laugh small. Words braided with gestures. Accents, rituals, warnings. They folded into a rhythm you learned to follow. Which rooms whispered it, and where does the trail thin? Sometimes it thins in a quiet hallway, no applause, only footsteps. Sometimes it gathers in a laugh that keeps others small. Sometimes it stops between two people who do not speak. Trace the seams. Notice where it learned to wait. Then follow where it keeps talking, even in empty rooms. It arrives in the taste of broth at dusk, in a reprimand whispered on a porch, in a teacher's pause that meant, not enough. These fragments fold into a single tone. You carry them like a habit. Where did yours first settle? They lived in the rhythm of family sentences, in the precise clink of spoons, in a teacher's clipped correction, in evening prayers and bartered praises. Small, ordinary lines stitched into a rulebook. No one said, "This is yours." Yet the script settled. Which fragment still speaks when you wake?
Reach back. The voice carries the kitchen's cadence, a mother's soft warning, a teacher's clipped correction, a street caller's urgency. Language leaves deposits, tones pressed into posture, phrases folded into breath. Over years they become muscle memory. You speak them before you think. Pause. Whose mouth first shaped the syllable that says stop?
The voice has a family tree. It remembers the clatter of plates, the lullaby that corrected you mid-cry, the blunt phrase at the desk. Public shouts, market, sermon, scoreboard, tuck into your grammar. Over years those fragments sew into a single seam, an archive that speaks for you. Pause. Which ancestor is still speaking now? A single phrase. A look that stopped you. Small things, tone, timing, harden into rules. You learned obedience as a shape. Not argued into you. Worn into you. Sometimes the rule is useful. Sometimes it keeps you waiting. Sit with that pause. Which small command still pulls your hands? Listen. The voice is not only yours. It carries the rhythm of kitchens and classrooms, the clipped not yet of a teacher, the laugh that smoothed the scolding. Lines stitched from other mouths. Comforts and warnings sewn together. Trace them back, slowly. Whose cadence do you still answer to? Listen for small shapes, a mother clearing plates, a father's tight smile, a neighbor's passing praise. These accents settle like dust and shape the grammar of reply. Notice 1. Name it. Sit with it. See what wants to be said next. Remember the first time a phrase landed. A quiet command. A sharp look. A promise disguised as instruction. A child's ear learned its contour and kept it. It settled like a map under the ribs. Listen to its edges. What year did it begin? What did it mean then? Maybe it was one sentence. A tone that folded the room quiet. A hand on a shoulder. The rule arrived as feeling, not argument. You learned to move around it. Later it named choices you hadn't made yet. Sit with that small script. Listen for its accent. Where did it slow your breath first?
Listen, a kitchen at dusk. A reprimand folded into a lullaby. The accent of your mother's warning. A teacher's sigh after class. Public signs and Sunday lessons. Language settles like dust in the ear. You carry someone else's grammar. Where did they tuck their demands inside you? On the table, a command arrives with the spoon. A name taught between bites. I am learned in the courtroom. A teacher's sigh that becomes a rule. We inherit not just phrases but tones. Accents of obligation. Follow them back. Whose room do they open onto?
Sometimes the voice smells of boiled rice and late-night reprimands. It carries lullabies, a father's clipped sentence, a teacher's public correction. Whole towns fold into its cadence. Follow the consonants. Track the pauses. Each inflection opens a door. What house waits on the other side? Find the room where it began. A dim kitchen light. Utensils clink in time. A teacher's laugh that stayed on the tongue. Small rules folded into bedtime rituals. Language becomes a map. Each phrase a brick. Listen. You can hear the builders. Who laid the first stone? Names slip between plates. A mother's tone that taught restraint. A schoolyard chant that taught shame. Accents, prayers, rules, small rituals that press speech into bone. You carry their timbers, lullabies, admonitions, public applause. They stitch a grammar for desire and fear. Trace the seams without accusation. See the hands that sewed them. Where did they learn to speak to you? A single sentence. A look that tightened the room. A child's ear learns to obey tone. Not now. You'll break it. Small commands harden into habit. You carry them in posture and pause. They return without context. Listen, what first rule still moves you, quietly, as if it were your own. Often it lives in small snapshots. A bowl set down. A clipped correction. A laugh that ended before it started. Phrases learned between elbows and recipes. Tones that season decisions. You carry them like recipes in your posture. Trace one, slowly. Where does yours begin? Maybe it begins at a sink, the scrape of a spoon, a mother's sigh. Or in a classroom, a single quiet that landed like instruction. A neighbor's whisper. A hymn. Voices stacking into grammar. They fold into posture, into the way you wait. Notice one. Where did it sit? Who gave it weight? Follow it back. To kitchens where rules came with supper. To classrooms where a single word shaped posture. To hymns, headlines, scolding at a playground. Voices layered into grammar. Not accusation. Provenance. Whose voice is it, stitched from many?
Then one moment settles. A phrase, a look, a frightened silence. It clicks like a lid. You learn the rule by tone, not content. Years later it speaks first. You listen. What was the first line that claimed you? Often it arrives not as an idea, but as a texture. A plate set down too hard. A look that shortened a laugh. A reprimand learned in the shape of breath. These fragments sow a private grammar. You move from it without thinking. Listen. Which fragment still sits at the table?
It usually came as a line, soft, urgent, familiar. A sentence shaped by someone else's breath. Here it's rhythm. The meaning can shift, the tone lingers. Sometimes it still speaks before you do. Notice the space it leaves. Notice what it expects. And, for a moment, wonder, what would happen if you answered differently? It came from kitchens and schoolyards. From the cadence of a grandmother's warning. From a teacher's clipped correction. A language folded into your mouth. You learn to echo before you learn to name. Trace a sentence back and you'll find many hands. Which one still holds you? A single look. A phrase repeated until it stopped sounding like speech. Not now. Be quiet. Tone became law. You learned its shape. It fit. Later, it moved into decisions, small, automatic. Notice one imprint. Name it. Wait. See what shifts when the old rule loosens. Follow that echo backward. A mother's laugh in the kitchen. A teacher's clipped correction. A prayer muttered at dusk. Small scenes. They pressed into you until they sounded like truth. First outside. Then inside. Where did they meet? What room taught you to answer? A hallway at dusk. A reprimand softened into habit. You learned to translate breath into obedience. Now listen, not to fix, but to notice. Whose rhythm owns that pause? Think of a kitchen voice, mother's warning folded into lullaby. A teacher's clipped phrase. Public murmurs at the table. These small sounds stitch into a narrator. Where did their grammar come from?
It arrives in ordinary afternoons. Grandmother proverbs, scraped plates, teacher corrections, playground taunts. Little rituals translate into grammar. You carry them as sentences you didn't write. Where, exactly, do they end, and where do you begin? They arrived as small commands. A recipe of silence. A scold folded into kindness. You learn their rhythms by heart. Slowly, you realize they were never private. Whose breath carries them now? They lived in kitchens and corridors. In lullabies, reprimands, the hush after a mistake. Outside voices folded inward, tidy and unasked. Sit with that. Where did one of them begin to name you?
Names arrived at the table. A reprimand in a living room. A teacher's tone lingered. Language is braided, lullaby, command, proverb. They stitched sense into a small voice. You learned to answer before you knew the question. Who else lives in that answer? It arrived at the table. A softened rebuke. A teacher's rhythm. Lullabies folded into rules. Small rituals became grammar. You learned rooms of obligation. The voice lodged there patient, unmarked. Some of it comforts. Some of it is someone else's map. Listen. Words came folded in soup steam, in lullaby cadence. A reprimand at dawn. A praise that became a boundary. They settle, unnoticed, into how you speak. Whose grammar is this? They came from kitchens and classrooms. From a parent's sigh, an uncle's joke, a teacher's tally. Phrases folded into habit. Languages handed down like clothing that never quite fits. Listen again. Can you hear who first chose its shape?
A voice arrives as cadence, a reprimand, a quiet praise, a laugh in a hallway. It settles like dust. Name it, softly. Where did it learn to insist, and who kept repeating it? It inherits accents, a kitchen's reprimand, a grandmother's lullaby, a teacher's clipped syllable. These small laws stitch into posture and pause. Listen, not to judge, but to trace where they began. A single phrase settles. A look becomes law. A child's ear learns the shape of command. Years later, decisions follow that cadence. Hold one memory. Listen to what it still asks.
Listen, this cadence carries names: a mother's hush, a teacher's sharpness, a neighbor's reprimand. Echoes folded into you. Trace one back. Whose voice is this, really? Listen. A lullaby turned command. A clipped correction at dusk. Small sounds that taught you to obey. Not blame. Just notice their texture, where they soothe, where they tighten, then follow the doorway they came through. Trace it back, the clatter of plates, a scold folded into blessing, a teacher's breath. Language settles like dust. Not blame, archival detail. Whose rhythms taught you cadence? There's a room where that voice learned to speak. A single phrase. A look that tightened the air. A command that folded into a child's heartbeat. It became a rule, soft and absolute. Listen, can you feel the shape it left, still warm? Before you, rooms taught you to listen. Names at the table. A reprimand's cadence. A teacher's tired rhythm. These small echoes stitched themselves into your grammar, a borrowed accent. They came folded into supper, into lessons, into announcements. Grandparents' rhythm. Teacher's sharp breath. Market cries. Each became grammar. Whose echo are you rehearsing now? Listen, a mother's caution, a teacher's clipped sentence, a street call stitched into a steady murmur. You carry them like pockets, and sometimes you forget which pocket is yours. They arrive folded into evenings, knife on cutting board, a reprimand under fluorescent light, praise from the playground. Small languages settle into your chest. Whose rhythm are you following?
Maybe it began as a mother's timing, a coach's cadence, a city's hush. You learned to move by those measures. Now, what parts are still yours, and which only echo? Grandmother's kitchen, a reprimand half hidden in lullaby. Schoolyard chants, public signs that taught worth in silence. These lines stitched themselves into your rhythm. Listen, can you hear where they begin and where you might end?
A sentence lands. Small, sharp. An afternoon. I'll look. A rule stitched from tone and breath. You obey before you understand. Try to remember what voice first taught your ribs to still. Those early rules arrive like family weather. A kitchen sentence. A teacher's cadence. A public scold folded into your breath. You speak in borrowed accents. Whose voice keeps answering for you?
You start with small scenes. A mother's clipped warning at the sink. A teacher tracing letters. A radio hymn in winter. These moments fold together into an archive that answers before you do. They were not all yours. A lullaby folded into reprimand. Lessons served with soup. Public shames, polite silences, each line pressed into the ear. Listen, whose grammar guides your quiet? You carry phrases like heirlooms. Some are gentle, some cut. They arrive uninvited, tone, rhythm, rule. Sit with one. Notice its shape. Ask, softly, who taught it to live inside you?
Listen for the rooms that taught your voice: kitchens, schoolyards, a scolding in a hallway. Language settles like ash. Each sentence, a small inheritance. Where did this rhythm begin? And who keeps repeating it? A grandmother's teaspoon. A teacher's clip not yet. Headlines murmuring from the radio. Small commands become grammar. We carry others' cadences like heirlooms. Trace them back. Notice who stitched the lines that keep speaking. Once, a look froze. A tone became law. Small moments lodged like weather in a child's chest. We obeyed without meaning to. Listen, what single phrase still wakes you, quietly, before the day begins? Names, kitchens, schoolyards, each syllable finds a home. A mother's hush. A teacher's scold. Laughter on the radio. They stitch a grammar inside us. Trace it back. Who first taught that cadence? Meals, lullabies, reprimands. Words parked in rooms. Accent, rhythm, a shame sigh. They settle like wallpaper. Family, language, law, layer upon layer. Which of those hands still guides your mouth? Once, a phrase landed like a small stone. A look made the air thin. You learned to rule by tone, not reason. Later, that rule kept opening and closing a door. It appears elsewhere. In a mother's quiet correction. In a teacher's clipped tone. In the brief shrug of a radio voice. These borrowed cadences settled like weather. Where did that weather learn to speak?
Dinner plates, a teacher's clipped breath, a lullaby's warning. Tone migrates inward faster than meaning. Small images sow themselves into habit. We carry those seams, unnoticed, persistent. Where do they lead next? They lead back. Voices at the table. A lullaby's cadence. A teacher's clipped rule. Phrases we learn to carry. Language becomes habit. Habits become law. Trace them home, slowly. See who first spoke, and why.
Listen. A mother's warning over a simmering pot. A teacher's clipped answer in a hallway. The radio's insistence at dusk. These small echoes stitched together. Follow the seams. Who owned each stitch? They came through warm bowls, reprimands over dirty hands, songs at dusk. Small grammars taught before names. You carry them half-remembered, unclaimed, waiting to be asked where they begin. They arrived in accents and lullabies. In the kitchen's half-light. In a teacher's soft insistence. In public shames that settled like dust. You learned their rhythm. Sometimes you still speak them. Which one is yours? You felt them settle, grandmother's recipes of caution, a father's clipped approval, a teacher's patient corrections. They braided into your grammar. Habit hardened. Between spoon and sentence you learned to answer, often before you knew the question. Once, one sentence. I'll look. The room held it like a seal. A small rule formed exact, immovable. You carried it, unsure which day made it yours, whose voice.
Later, other rooms added syllables, a mother's correction, a teacher's sigh, the applause you learned to crave. They folded into that original rule. You obeyed them, quietly. Did you notice, or only answer? They came from rooms before yours. Kitchens where anger tasted like caution. Lessons where praise was conditional. A father's offhand rule. A teacher's repeated phrase. These are not accusations. They are maps. Learn them slowly. Listen. Names spoken at the table. A lullaby's cadence. The way phrases land in a child's chest. Language is inheritance. Small domestic sounds become scripts. Turn them. Hold them like objects. Ask, who first spoke this line? Let the question sit.
Listen to the room's grammar. A mother's sigh. A teacher's sharpness. These small noises knit into rules. Trace them like fingerprints. You may find familiar shapes. You may not. Let that curiosity open. Over years they tuck into the quiet. A phrase becomes rule. A tone becomes a map. You follow with surprising ease. No drama. Just habit. Stay with that tenderness. See where the map phrase, what opens beyond it. Listen. The voice carries a small archive, a mother's hush, a schoolyard rule, a neighbor's warning. They stitch themselves into rhythm. Not theft, inheritance. Follow one thread. See where it leads. Grandmother's soup. A teacher's clipped phrase. A sermon at dusk. Lines settle into grammar. Language becomes home. We live in borrowed sentences. Whose words shape the questions we ask? They arrive folded, soup-scented lullabies, a teacher's clipped correction, a sermon hummed at dusk. We inherit patterns, not promises. Somewhere between those gestures, a stranger's voice learned our name and stayed? Meals, nicknames, corrections, lessons deposited like wallpaper. Familiar, unseen. A phrase surfaces and you do not know who first spoke it. Whose hand drew these margins?
They arrive folded into lullabies. Grammar, the way reprimands soften at dusk. 100 small inheritances become one tone. We carry them, so who speaks now? It lives in kitchens. In the clipped tone at the breakfast table. In the first lesson and the public correction. Names, rules, references, small deposits that settle. Follow them back. Which mouth first placed this voice? It braided itself into lullabies and reprimands. Into your grammar, your margins. Voices you learn to answer before you learn to ask. Whose syllable still wakes you, late at night, asking what you owe?
Look back. A kitchen hum. A reprimand at dusk. A neighbor's laugh. Language settles like dust. You carry a chorus of small scenes. Which line is yours? Which borrowed?